He ended up jumping off the ship to try to, like, swim back to shore and drowned, which I don't know what you expected to happen, buddy. Like, why would you do that? I don't understand. So yeah, he drowned, and after he died, there were no more kings in Lothlorien. Hello, welcome to my channel, and welcome to my YouTube project, Makeup and Middle-earth Monday, a show where I do a makeup look and talk about a topic I picked out from the Tolkien Legendarium. Today's topic will be the follow-up to last episode, part 2 of Elven Realms and Cities of Middle-earth. This topic was chosen by my friends who were kind enough to vote in the poll. If you would like to contribute your opinion on future topics, please consider checking out my Facebook page. Link is in the description box below. Or consider checking out my Patreon. Patreon votes currently count twice for Facebook polls. Today's makeup look is going to be something I'm doing from the available races at the LARP I currently go to every month. It's called Vanguard. It's located in North Carolina. If you've been looking for a LARP like around that area, I can't recommend Vanguard more. They have a lot of really diverse fantasy races, some of which involve body paint, like the one I'm doing today. The one I'm testing out for this video is the automaton race, and basically they're like a race of artificial humanoids, and they look, you know, like they're made of like metallic materials and stuff like that. So it's going to be an experiment, but I have like a general idea what I'm going to do. I'm going to try to just use my own hair today because I want to see if I can like do like an outline kind of, but if it doesn't work out, then I have like a wig I'm going to use as a backup. But anyway, let's get started. So I finished last episode covering the fall of Gondolin, and you know, my coverage of that was pretty abridged because there was a lot more going on. But today I'm going to start with Lindon. After the War of Wrath absolutely wrecked Beleriand, Lindon became like the westernmost region of Middle-earth. It was actually the only part of Beleriand that survived the War of Wrath. And I guess for context, what happened with that was essentially all of the Valar and all of like the Vanyar and the Teleri and the Noldor and, you know, whoever else was in Valinor at the end of the First Age all came to defeat Morgoth, and this war was so intense. It went on for I think like 50 odd years, and just by the end of it, it had been like so much just straight up all out war that it just destroyed the continent, and Beleriand like just sunk into the ocean basically. So when you look at like modern day maps of Middle-earth, there used to be like most of a continent there where the sea is on like the western part now, which is just like crazy to me. So Lindon means land of the singers. It became known by this in the Second Age. In the First Age it was known as Osiriand, and Osiriand was also known as the land of seven rivers, and was inhabited by Nandor elves originally, who got permission from King Thingol of Doriath to live there in the First Age. Gil-galad became officially recognized as the High King of, it's like the elves of the West in the beginning of the Second Age, and he ruled from Lindon until his death in the Last Alliance towards the end of the Second Age. And after he passed away, Círdan, the shipwright, one of Gil-galad's lieutenants, became lord and remained so like until into the Fourth Age. And if anybody has any like information on like narrative about Círdan specifically, I would be very interested to see it, because I feel like he's one of those dudes that's like, he's always like in the background doing really helpful stuff, but like I've never actually seen anything that has focused specifically on Círdan like as a plot line. And he seems like a really cool dude that just helps everybody out and never seems to make any bad decisions, so Cool. Alright, so in the first year of the Second Age, the Grey Havens, also called the Mythland, were built in the newly formed Gulf of Lune, and this was formed in the wake of the destruction of Beleriand. And 600 years into the Second Age, the Grey Havens are actually where the Númenóreans first make contact with the elves again. And this is after, like, the foundation of Númenor. Later on, during the war with Sauron in the Second Age, is also the Grey Havens were where the fleet of Númenóreans, led by Tar Minastir, landed in order to basically, like, help the elves after, like, Sauron's forces had completely overrun Eriador. And this force of Númenóreans were what drove him back and sent him running like a little... Aside from Rivendell, Mythland had the highest population of Noldor elves still living in Middle-earth at the time. And about 1,000 years into the Third Age, I'm jumping around a little bit, but the Grey Havens at Mythland is also where the wizards first appeared. So they arrived there on a boat from Valinor, and when they landed, Círdan actually gave his Ring of Power, Narya, to Gandalf. Narya is the Ring of Fire. It had the power to inspire people to resist tyranny, and it had the same type of preservation powers that, like, all of the other Elven rings had. The Grey Havens were also where an elf named Galdor was sent from to kind of be an emissary at Rivendell during Elrond's council in the Third Age. And Círdan the Shipwright was actually the last of the elves to travel to Valinor, and his final ship bore himself and Galadriel's husband, Celeborn. Samwise Gamgee, who was also given the honor of traveling to the Undying Lands decades after Frodo and Bilbo sailed west, he also sailed from the Grey Havens with Círdan the Shipwright. He was given this honor because, like, even very briefly, he was still a ring bearer. Yeah, that's what I thought, bitch. I broke my eyeliner because it wasn't working. And of course, after I break it, it starts performing correctly. But Mythland wasn't the only settlement in Lindon, it was just the most populated. This doesn't have to be neat, I'm just kind of mapping out where I want everything to go. Two other harbors border the Gulf of Lune. If you're looking at it on a map, basically the Grey Havens were the farthest, like, east point in the Gulf, like where the river fed into the Gulf. And then there was Forland, which was the name of the settlement on the northern part of the Gulf closest to the actual ocean. And then close to, like, the midway point between Forland and the Grey Havens was Harland on, like, the southern part of the Gulf. I should probably find a map and just kind of, like, but the area that Harland was in was called Harlindon. Harlindon was where Galadriel and Celeborn had been living from the beginning of the Second Age until they moved to Eregion in, like, 750 of the Second Age, I think. All three of the, like, harbors in Lindon saw ships sail to Valinor throughout the ages, but the Grey Havens had the most. Okay, anyway, I had a brief intermission to get a new pencil since the other eyeliner is trash, I guess. This is a good segue into Eregion, actually. So, Eregion means Land of Holly in Sindarin, and was a Noldorin realm in the region of Eriador. By the time, like, the Third Age rolls around, this area was called Hollin. It was founded by a group of elves, among them Celebrimbor, who was the grandson of Feanor, whom I have mentioned in previous videos. Celebrimbor was an extremely skilled and talented elven smith, and he was interested in the mithril that the dwarves were mining in Khazad-dûm at the time. He essentially left Lindon to found Eregion with a lot of elves, including Galadriel and Celeborn, eventually, and they also brought a lot of their own people. Celebrimbor, though, was part of a group of elven smiths called the Gwaith Myrdain, also known as the Jewel Smiths. Some sources claim Celebrimbor founded Eregion, and some say that Galadriel and Celeborn did. I've gotten kind of mixed opinions about this, and I'm not sure what exactly would be considered accurate, but I do know that Professor Tolkien had been like revising some of Galadriel and Celeborn's backstory at the time of his death, so I think it's difficult to say like what actually happened. Yeah, that's a little ambiguous, but okay, so if you're looking at a map, Eregion is actually like west of Moria, near Moria's western gate, and unlike a lot of elvish realms, they had really good relations with the dwarves. They did a lot of like collaboration with the dwarves there to make some cool stuff. And you know, Moria is also where Sauron and Celebrimbor and all the other craftsmen that were involved crafted the Rings of Power. And the capital of Eregion is Osten-Ethel. This was actually connected to Moria via a high road during the peak of their like collaboration, so you could actually get there pretty easily. Galadriel and Celeborn lived there from 750 of the Second Age until Galadriel departed for Lorien around 1350 of the Second Age with their daughter Celebrian. I am a little unclear on the timeline of Celebrian herself, but we know she was born early in the Second Age and lived in Eregion with her parents until she like joined her mother when Galadriel left to go to Lorien, and Celeborn remained in Eregion for some time after that. I think because he didn't want to travel through Moria, which is how Galadriel crossed the Misty Mountains to get to her destination. We have to remember that Celeborn is a Cinder elf, and Galadriel is a Noldor elf. The Noldor had decent relations with the dwarves, but Celeborn's people were first ruled by Thingol, and the dwarves killing Thingol and sacking Doriath were really what started like the bad blood, just for some context, I guess. So he remained in Eregion for the time being. This is a new product, so I'm gonna be interested to see if it performs well. Yeah, not bad. Dang, this stuff is actually pretty nice. So the Gwaith Myrdain kind of took control of Osten-Ethel at this point. Like, when the Rings of Power were created, though, Celebrimbor forged the 3 elven rings without Sauron's help. But all the other rings they did together. But once the Master Ring was created, the elves, like, immediately knew that Sauron was Sauron, and he was trying to, you know, take over with this ring scheme. So Celebrimbor hid the rings. He sent one to Galadriel. He sent the two others to Gil-galad, I believe. It's a good thing he did, because Sauron was like, "Hey, you have to give these back. I need them back. If you're not gonna use them, just give them back. Just give them back." And when they refused to return the rings and hid them instead, Sauron decided to attack Eregion, and in 1697 of the Second Age, his armies come and Eregion is sadly destroyed. Many survivors flee either to Lindon or Lothlorien, and others ended up going with Elrond to actually found Rivendell. During this time, Sauron took Celebrimbor captive and unfortunately tortured him for information on the locations of all of the other Rings of Power. He did eventually give up the locations of the Dwarven rings, but he never gave away where he had sent the Elven rings. So, good job, man. Like, something worked out at least. But eventually Sauron, like, still killed him, and after he killed Celebrimbor, he used his body as a war banner. So that's like, oh my, that's so friggin' metal. He just like put his body on a pole and carried it on his way to try to destroy Lindon. And then during the attack on Eregion... No! It's fine. I was gonna go over it anyway. Since Celeborn had remained behind after Galadriel left, he actually ended up leading a sortie, like, out of the city trying to drive back Sauron's forces. He didn't have, like, a lot of people with him, but it was successful enough that he was able to force Sauron back enough for Celeborn to meet up with Elrond's force. And they, like, Sauron still won technically, but I just thought it was a little bit of interesting trivia to share that he actually did lead, like, a group of warriors against Sauron's army, since he's furniture in the movies. Yeah, I like this a lot. It was really easy to use. I've never used this product before, but yeah, I like this a lot. It's the Mehron Cream Blend stick. I don't know why I showed it, because I have the video mirrored. So, like I said, Galadriel left for a place called Lordaeron, and it's unclear what exactly she and Celeborn got up to, like, after the Númenóreans showed up to knock Sauron down a few pegs. They might have traveled to Rivendell, they might have visited a few other places. At some point they had their daughter with them again, too. Eventually they do both come to settle in Lordaeron together with Celebrian, or as most people probably know it, Lothlorien. Believe it or not, Lothlorien has been around quite a bit longer than Galadriel and Celeborn were ruling there. Longer than either of them have actually been in Middle-earth, I think. It was first settled before the First Age, during the time when the Vala Orome was helping elves migrate west away from Cuivianen, which I talked about last time. The forest area where Lothlorien was eventually founded was first settled by Sylvan elves who were basically, like, too afraid to cross the Misty Mountains. Like, they didn't want anything to do with it, so that's where they settled. And it's kind of funny because it's relatively close to Mirkwood, like, on a map, but it's funny to look at because Mirkwood is huge. Like, on a map, Mirkwood is, like, this big. Lothlorien is, like, this big. And Lothlorien has had several names historically, among them Laurelin Dorenan, which is Quenya for Valley of Singing Gold, Lorinand, which is, like, the language that the Nandor elves were using at the time, and that means Valley of Gold, Laurenande, which is Quenya for Valley of Gold, Glornan, which is Sindar for Valley of Gold, Nanlar, which is also Sindar for Valley of Gold, I guess? I don't know. That's what my source says. Lindorinand, which is Nandor for Vale of the Land of Singers, and Dwimardine, which is, I believe, what the Rohirrim called it, and that means Haunted Valley or Valley of Illusions. They also didn't want anything to do with the creepy woods, I guess. The lady in the creepy woods. But it eventually also came to be called Lorien in memory of the Lorien that the Noldor actually left behind when they left Valinor. Before Galadriel and Celeborn came to Lothlorien, it actually had a king. And they themselves didn't rule there until, like, much later. The timeline for this is a little vague, and this is, you know, like, I think this is kind of, expect this to be vague, because a lot of stuff in this video is kind of, like, I had to make some assumptions. But we know that Amdir was a Sindarin elf, and he became king of Lorinand sometime before year 730 of the Second Age. It's at this point, like, when he becomes king there, that the primary language spoken in Lothlorien began to shift and eventually changed to Sindarin versus the language of the Sylvan or the Nandor elves who had been living there first. And they didn't really have any of their own leaders left, so he kind of filled a void for them, basically. And Lorien actually existed in relative peace all the way up until Sauron returned to Middle-earth after the fall of Númenor. So that's kind of like a really long time. And at that point, the Last Alliance became a thing, and Amdir, the first king of Lothlorien, was actually killed during the Battle of Dagorlad. This is the same battle that Isildur cut the ring from Sauron's hand during, But yeah, he was actually killed during the last alliance when he and his forces were like cut off from like the major group, and they ended up in the dead marshes. So like when you see all those bog bodies in the dead marshes later on when like Frodo and Sam are there, I think like the majority of them came from Amdir and his forces getting like stranded there and like overpowered. Yeah, fun fact. Maybe not fun for them, but trivia. Woo. Amdir's son Amroth became king in Lothlorien after the last alliance, and he ruled there until about 1981 of the Third Age. It always throws me off when I'm looking at dates for this, and it's like, 1981? What? Like, that's a real year. Yeah, during the time that Amroth was king, he built this, like, mound, I guess. It's like a hill mound thing that was called Cairn Amroth. It was the mound of King Amroth. It was a hill that had Eleanor flowers growing in it, and there were 2 circles of trees on it. The outer were white bark, and the inner ring were Malorn trees. And the king actually built his house there in the Malorn trees, I believe. In the Third Age, Cairn Amroth, way after his house is gone, is actually where Aragorn and Arwen pledge to marry each other, or like, you know, pledge themselves to one another. That is also when Aragorn actually gives Arwen the Ring of Barahir, and if you watched my Finrod episode, you'll know all about the Ring of Barahir. My editor Sten is threatening to start a bonk counter every time I hit the mic. So, we'll see if that ends up here. The Malorn trees in Lothlorien actually were not native to Lothlorien. They came with Galadriel when she moved there. So the Malorn trees originally came from Valinor. Some of the nuts were given... The nuts or the saplings were given to the Númenóreans, and so they grew on Númenor, and then the Númenóreans gave some of the nuts to High King Gil-galad in Lindon, so that he could try to grow the trees, but they wouldn't grow in Lindon's soil, so he ended up giving them to Galadriel, and she took them with her to Lothlorien, where they thrived, especially like with her Ring of Power. By this point she had that, so that helped them like really grow, and it helped Lothlorien really flourish. The Malorn trees are like described as being similar to beech trees as far as their bark is concerned. They have like smooth, like silvery bark, and they would produce golden flowers. Their leaves were green on top and like silver underneath, but during the fall they turned gold, and they didn't actually fall off the trees until spring came around again, at which point like they immediately grew new green leaves. So I think that's kind of cool, like if you have leaves on your trees all year round and they're like pretty color. But yeah, hence the name the Golden Wood. And these trees grew to like enormous size, like they were huge. Obviously, like the elves built all of their buildings in these gigantic Malorn trees. I'm assuming they're like, you know, the size of like redwoods basically. But yeah, well, I mean, yeah, you built Cairn Amroth in them, and then like all the buildings we see in the Fellowship of the Ring are built in them. King Amroth's beloved was a Sylvan elf named Nimrodel, and there's actually like a stream named after her, because it's a sad story. Like, essentially, she was not thrilled about all of the like Noldor and Sindar elves that were coming to the Golden Wood after like the fall of Eregion and like after the last alliance, because she thought they were just going to bring like war and conflict and all that upsetting stuff. So she refused to marry the king unless he could bring her to, quote, a place of peace. And he was like, okay, well, I mean, I guess we could go to Valinor. So they agree to go. They get separated, and she, I believe the prevailing theory is that she drowns in this stream and he doesn't know where she is, so he finds a boat for them, and the last boat that's leaving from this particular harbor that he's arrived to, it's the very last boat. Brief intermission from Lorien to squeeze in like this one elven realm real quick. The harbor he sailed west from was this place called Etheland, and it was actually considered part of the realm of Gondor at the time. It was originally like a small refugee camp for Sindar elves fleeing from Morgoth during the First Age, but over time it grew larger as like more Nandor or Sylvan elves like came down the river to migrate there. After Eregion was destroyed, that was when this particular harbor started sending ships westward. By the time Amroth sailed from here in the Third Age, he was on the last ship that ever left Etheland, and the place became abandoned after that. And Amroth was the last king of Lorien, so he went on this ship, but Nimrodel never joined him, so he ended up jumping off the ship to try to like swim back to shore and drowned, which I don't know what you expected to happen, buddy. Like, why would you do that? I don't understand. So yeah, he drowned, and after he died, there were no more kings in Lothlorien, and then Celeborn and Galadriel became Lord and Lady of the Golden Wood. At this point, Galadriel has Nenya, her own ring of power, and she used it to protect Lorien from Sauron and to like preserve the wood itself and, you know, keep the trees flourishing. Galadriel and Celeborn built Cadas Galadhon in the branches of these trees about 1,000 years into the Third Age. The lembas that they gave the Fellowship were actually wrapped in Malorn leaves, and Galadriel gave Samwise Gamgee a Malorn nut as a gift when the Fellowship left, and she also gave him, like, some dirt from her garden. Cadas Galadhon itself was built on this piece of land called the Nath, or the Ninth, of Lothlorien, and this was basically like a wedge-shaped, narrow piece of land between the rivers Anduin and the Celebrant. Celebrant was also called the Silverlode, and this flowed from its source in the Mirror, which was an enchanted lake that if you looked at it, you could see like the starry night sky shining above even during the day, and you would see like a crown like suspended over your reflection, I guess. But time actually passed like differently for the Fellowship when they were in Lorien versus like when they left. Sam actually thought he thought they had only been there for like maybe a week, but when they left, it had turned out they had been there for like a whole month. So there's some time dilation between the woodlands and the rest of the map, thanks a lot to the power of her ring. And then after the Ring of Power was destroyed, Galadriel and Celeborn went to Dol Guldur, and this was one of Sauron's former strongholds in southern Mirkwood. They stormed it and rid the area of his influence once and for all. Afterwards, Thranduil, the king of Mirkwood, actually like gave them like the area there, and it was renamed East Lorien for a while. After Galadriel departed for Valinor, Celeborn remained in East Lorien for a little while before he basically got lonely and decided to go to Rivendell. And he stayed in Rivendell for a while before finally following his wife like to the Undying Lands with Círdan. After Celeborn's departure from Lorien, it gradually became depopulated, and like most of the Sylvan elves there moved to like Mirkwood, and eventually it is completely abandoned. And Arwen actually comes back here in year 121 of the Fourth Age when there's nobody in Lothlorien anymore. And this is after Aragorn has passed away. She comes back here and she goes to Cairn Amroth, which is where they decided to, you know, promise themselves to each other, and she lays down on the hill like with the flowers and she passes away there, and that's where her grave is, like until the world is like broken and remade basically. So sad but romantic. And of course I've saved my personal favorite Elven realm for last, and that's Rivendell. Rivendell was founded by Arwen's father Elrond. After the fall of Eregion, his army had been forced to retreat northward and they ended up traveling up along the River Bruinen. Rivendell, or Imladris, which means deep valley, was built like on a narrow gorge, and it was hidden and protected by like the surrounding mountains. And actually, Rivendell's geography was inspired by a real place. There's this valley, I guess, in Switzerland called Lauterbrunnen, and Tolkien had like actually traveled there at one point, and there's a piece of artwork that he did of Rivendell that is very, very similar to this valley in Switzerland. Rivendell was actually called the last homely house for those traveling like east, away from like the more condensed civilization, and it was called the first homely house for those traveling west towards like the more condensed civilization. It had a steep zigzag path that led down to like the valley floor, and we actually know that mostly beech and oak trees grew there. I think the fact that we know what kind of vegetation like was there is just, that level of detail is just so cool that we have that we know that he actually like put thought into something like that. Like I love it. It's cool. I like it a lot. Although I guess if I didn't like Tolkien, I would be real sad that I have to do this show every 2 weeks. During this time, Gil-galad actually gives Elrond his Ring of Power, Velia, so that Elrond can use it to like protect his like new valley and like all of the people who are like traveling there for sanctuary from like all the crazy shit that's going on thanks to Sauron and his megalomania. And this is actually another example of an area that's protected by a Ring of Power having like a weird time distortion, because Rivendell kept its own calendar basically, and that's just like crazy to me. But you can also like, you can find this calendar online and you can look at it. Like it has like names and dates for the months and the days, and it's just cool. Elrond had control. Oh my god, this is cold. Elrond had control over the River Bruinen, and he could actually call it up in order to use it to protect Rivendell. And we see this happen when the river washes all of the Nazgul away when they're trying to get Frodo. That was Elrond. So Rivendell starts off as a stronghold for like refugees fleeing Sauron after he conquers Eregion, and he begins laying siege to Imladris after conquering Eregion because, you know, he wants everything. But fortunately, the Númenóreans arrive in a very timely manner, and they rescue Rivendell from destruction. They help Rivendell essentially break the siege that Sauron has been laying on them. And then in 1701 of the Second Age, Galadriel and her daughter Celebrian traveled to Rivendell trying to find Celeborn after, you know, all the stuff went down. And this is actually when Celebrian first meets Elrond. They later get married in year 109 of the Third Age. They have twin sons in year 130, Elladan and Elrohir, and then they have a daughter, Arwen, in year 241. After the destruction of Númenor, when Sauron again returns to power, Gil-galad and Elrond actually used Rivendell to stage the Last Alliance. And they were there mustering like troops for 3 years. Among those armies were the last men of Númenor, King Elendil and his sons, one of whom is Isildur, who cuts the ring off Sauron's finger. He did that in year 3441 of the Second Age. Not year 3434. That's like a little date that they got wrong in the Peter Jackson movies. Fun fact. But he did that in year 3441, and then during this battle is when his father, King Elendil, and King Gil-galad were both killed, like, dueling Sauron. They defeated him, but they died in the process, basically. And after Gil-galad's death, Elrond more or less becomes, like, Lord of the Noldor. But by that point, there were so few Noldor remaining in Middle-earth that, like, he saw no reason to actually declare himself king. Even though, like, he probably could have, because he is, like, you know, he does have, like, royal blood. But, yeah, I think he was just, like, he didn't see a point. After Isildur and his elder sons were killed in the Gladden Fields, his youngest son, Valindyl, became his next heir. And Valindyl had actually been living in Rivendell at the time because he had been a child, you know, during the Last Alliance, so he wasn't able to fight. But he became the heir, and he was actually there being fostered by Elrond. So Elrond allowed him to stay there and learn until he was old enough to take over and become king in the north. In Third Age, 1356, the kingdom of Angmar rose to power, and Angmar besieged Rivendell, but reinforcements from Lothlorien arrived in a timely manner and were able to help them once again break that siege, and their team up actually helped drive Angmar back for quite some time. Angmar didn't come back to attack them again until like 1974. That was when they conquered the kingdom of Arthedain, and Elrond sent Glorfindel with like a force to meet up with Círdan's army, and they defeated Angmar for good at the Battle of Fornost that time, but they were too late to like save Arthedain. And after the defeat of Angmar is when we see the tradition of like having Isildur's heirs fostered by Elrond and Rivendell actually kind of kick off. And Elrond also held on to a couple of the important heirlooms and historical artifacts that the heirs of Isildur would be given once they like came of age, one of which was the shards of the sword Narsil, which is, you know, the sword that cut the ring off of Sauron's fingies. Now we're going to jump all the way ahead into 2509 of the Third Age. This is when Elrond's wife, Celebrian, is tragically waylaid by orcs, and she's not killed, but she is tortured, and though she is eventually, like, rescued by her two sons, she was never able to, like, recover. Like, Elrond healed her, but, like, emotionally and mentally, like, she never recovered from that. So pretty soon after like they rescued her, she ends up boarding a boat to like leave for Valinor because she just couldn't get over this like torture that was visited on her. So like, yikes. After her like departure, her sons really kind of like go wild hunting orcs to kill them. So they also end up eventually becoming like pretty close friends with Aragorn himself. Like I believe he kind of grew up around them. And then of course we know Thorin's company stops in Rivendell on their quest to reclaim Erebor from the dragon Smaug. Bilbo described Rivendell as a perfect house, whether you like food or sleep, or storytelling, or singing, or just sitting and thinking best, or a pleasant mixture of them all. Sounds like my kind of place, honestly. Bilbo and Gandalf also stopped here on their way back to the Shire after the quest for Erebor had been completed. One of the halls in Rivendell is called the Hall of Fire, and it was called this because it had like a fire lit in it year-round. No. Well, it'll be alright. I guess I'll just... Actually, I like how that looks. It looks kind of cool. Alright, anyway. It had a fire year-round, and on, like, special occasions, like, I guess, holidays and stuff, it would be filled with people, like, singing and telling stories. During most of the year, though, it was a place for, like, quiet contemplation and study, where, like, nobody would come harass you if you wanted to just, like, sit in the quiet and, like, think about things. And it had like a large porch on the eastern wing of the building, and this porch is actually where the Council of Elrond took place. And this is what determined the fate of Sauron's Ring of Power, and this is also where everyone who had traveled to Rivendell for this council learned that all of the crap that had been like going down that they were concerned about was thanks to like the ring, and then like their fates were all tied to the fate of the ring, basically. And by this point, Rivendell had become like a place of learning and lorecraft. And while, you know, Elrond could defend it, you know, with his ring and like the geography of the valley and the river, he couldn't fortify it against like the entirety of Sauron's forces. So hence why they needed to like, you know, get it the hell out of there. And after the Ring of Power is destroyed, Elrond does leave for Valinor, but his sons Elladan and Elrohir remain behind for a while. Like, we don't really know, like, the text is unclear how long they stayed behind, or like if they ever actually went to Valinor. I think they probably did, since, you know, like, their father and their mother and like their family is all there, other than, you know, Arwen. But we don't actually know, like, for sure that they did. And we also don't really know how long after Elrond left did it take for Rivendell to become abandoned, but we do know that it did eventually become abandoned, because in like 4th Age 120, when Aragorn is about to pass, he mentions to Arwen that none now walk in the Garden of Elrond, so I can kind of assume that means that it's abandoned by that point. Also, I know I covered Mirkwood in last episode, but I'm just gonna circle back around now that these other places start to become abandoned. We don't have many details on what happened to Mirkwood, like, further into the 4th Age, but initially it did very well after the destruction of the Ring of Power. It seems to me that it was kind of the place to be, especially for Sylvan elves looking for somewhere to live after Lothlorien and places like that start to depopulate. So yeah, it initially did very well after the destruction of the One Ring, but the elves, you know, excuse me, the elves were still doomed to fade. So if they didn't eventually depart for Valinor, they would become, they would fade. Some sources seem to think that Wood became like part of the realm of Dale, or I guess just part of the Dominion of Men in general, which, you know, I buy that. That makes sense to me. But it's just, I think it's a very interesting way to look at the progression and gradual, like, I guess, devolvement of Elven culture, because, you know, in the Elder Days it was, yeah, elves all over the place, elves, and then, like, progressively, like, more and more, like, as you get further in through each age, there's less things, we just see things slowly become more and more part of the Dominion of Men. And I think the time dilation that is involved with the Rings of Power kind of thing, like the fact that you could go to Lothlorien and think you were only there for like a little while, and then you were actually there for like a whole month. I find that very interesting. I think it's a very cool way of working in the idea that these elves very much are part of like a dying world. Like the world is not dying, but it is changing, and they are unable to change with it. So it's, you know, like in fairy stories, like if you go missing, or you end up in like a fairy ring and you end up in the realm of fairy, you could be gone, like, I don't know, you think you're gone like a week, and then you come back and it's actually been like 10 years. That's like the first association that I made with this when I realized that there was a time dilation in Lorien and in Rivendell, and I would assume in the Grey Havens. The bad thing about doing my hair in a way that is away from my face, now my eyebrows are gonna be like, I gotta make sure they match. I was gonna glue rivets onto my face, but like, I don't know where they are. So for the purpose of this video, I'm just gonna draw them on. Okay. Sorry. I didn't expect to go through all the material that fast. I'm gonna do this just for you, YouTube, because I hate putting makeup on my ears, but in this case I think I'm gonna need to, just cause it's a little distracting. Yeah, that's better. So, this is the look. I wanted to go for like a faceplate kind of idea that was like a cosmetic thing, and then like the actual like metal paneling on the sides and stuff. And yeah, so this is what I decided to go with. So yeah, I don't know that I will ever make an automaton character, but if I did, this would probably be the makeup I decided to do. Yeah, so that's actually going to finish out my two-parter on this topic. I went through the material for this episode a lot faster than I was expecting to, somehow, but I had fun doing the makeup look. I was kind of flying by the seat of my pants, if I'm being honest, but like, I wanted it to kind of have like a, you know, like a doll, I guess, effect. But yeah, that's going to finish up my two-parter on this topic. Did I cover like all of the Elven realms you had hoped to hear about? Did I forget anything? I know this wasn't an exhaustive list by any means, because I was trying to keep it from like feeling too much like an encyclopedia entry. So hopefully this was interesting for you. But now that we've reached the end of the video, it is time for the Metal Music Monday segment. This week's song is Tyr by the Swedish band Brothers of Metal. They are actually one of my favorite bands. In 2021, I was in like the top 1% of listeners for them, which is insane to me. But I guess that probably tells you how much time I spend listening to Spotify, because like, dang, dude. They're one of like those themed metal bands that I really love. They cosplay Vikings and then just sing about Norse paganism. That's their whole thing. And it's great. A lot of their stuff is like, their lyrics can be really tongue-in-cheek, so like they don't take themselves like super duper seriously, but like all of their songs are a bop. Like they all boppin', and like I absolutely love this band. Please give them a shot. In the meantime, I hope you enjoyed our time together. I know I did, but even if you didn't, I appreciate you giving me the chance. If you did enjoy, I would love it if you would give me a like or leave me a comment, or even if you would hit that subscribe button. And if you could pick any Elven realm to live in, which would you choose? I personally pick Rivendell because I really love like the location. It's beautiful. There's like all the stuff that I find interesting to do, you can do in Rivendell. But which place would you choose to live? Let me know in the comments. I'm very interested to hear. Tune in 2 weeks from now when we talk about Morgoth, the original Dark Lord of Middle-earth. But for now, I hope you have a lovely day, and until next time, Namarie.